informed about the Transcontinental Railroad's links to the industrialists of Troy in that era. But today, we have with us Katie Brownell, who's a fourth grade teacher at Music Falls Schools, and she's talking about Sarah Rudd. And Katie is also on the board of the Bennington Battlefield, Friends of the Bennington Battlefield, and does youth programs for them and history programs for the Music Falls Schools, and lots of different stuff like that. So I'm turning over to Katie.
So I apologize if I'm belting, because I have good projection and I have to keep, 20-some kids engaged. So if I'm too noisy today, I want to thank you all for coming out and listening to Sarah's story. Actually, we were driving here, my daughter had said to me, "There's so many people on the very top, Mom," because believe it or not, we've gotten some good traffic for Sarah's story. And I said to her, well, it's an exciting time for us to be alive. Historically, we're staring at the edge of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, and in particular, the Battle of Bennington. That's semi-quincentennial for all of your vocabulary folk out there. So it is an exciting time, and I think we're also starting to look at not just the big names in history, but also some of the common people who have played important roles, and especially women whose voices are sometimes harder to trace through history. And as always, it starts with a good story, and that's what actually brought me to Sarah. So a story, I think, is a thing of many layers, and when my students come to me to report on a story about something that happened at recess, I actually usually tell them there's three sides to each of those stories. There's his side, her side, no, we find the truth. And that was really the case with Sarah's story as well. So I actually started learning about Sarah more deeply in the summer of 2022 when I began my research. It was a story I thought I knew, the story of a woman who put the safety of her children over her own comfort in a time of war and hardship. It was a beautiful story, a story of agency, decisiveness, survival, and motherhood bound up with the history of
Maryland Osgood.
In fact, I first encountered Sarah when I was not much older than she was in August of 1777, and two of my own children were aged close to some of hers. Like me, she was a wife, a mother. Like me, she was willing to do anything to take care of and protect her children. And that was the story I knew. And it is certainly a beautiful story and worth telling, but there was so much more to this remarkable woman. It turns out that I was really only looking at one small piece of a larger narrative of who she was. Sarah even had an interesting connection to my own home in Pittstown. I'll save that part for later. So Sarah Rudd lacked the ability to write her own story. In fact, the only evidence that we have of her life written by her own hand is a small X on her pension application. So I think it's fitting then that over 200 and almost 50 years, I, a woman, a wife, and a mother, am able to share Sarah's story with you. So to begin our talk today, we have to understand a little bit about the history of pensions. And I promise I won't bore you with this, because this is the stuff I get excited about. But I'll give you the Cliff Notes version here. The Continental Congress first passed pension legislation in August 1776 in order to supplement soldiers and sailors with half pay who had become disabled in the service of the United States. This half pay compensation was to continue through the duration of the disability. And pension law revision, as you can see, would continue to occur throughout the early years of the United States. Now, in September 1789, the newly established federal government officially took over the distribution of pensions. Go ahead. Great. In 1806, militiamen could now apply had they become disabled in service. And then in 18 1818, one could apply if they were experiencing financial hardship. Finally, on July 4th, 1836, the act stated that any widow of a serviceman who was eligible under the 1832 legislation would be entitled to receive his pension as long as she had been married to the veteran prior to his last term of service. Now, this would be the act which would allow Sarah Rudd, who is by this time a very old woman and a widow of many years, to apply for a pension for the service of her husband, Joseph Rudd. And she did so on September 21st, 1837, which happens to be my birthday. I think there's so many cool connections that I put together when I put this through. That was the first thing right there. So I met Sarah in her 1837 pension application. But before we meet her at the end of her age, we will understand her life in much greater detail if we allow ourselves to journey back to its beginning. Yes. Sarah Rudd was born in 1744 in Norwich, Connecticut. It was the same town in which Joseph Rudd, who would later become her husband, was born in 1740. Coincidentally, it was also the birthplace of America's best-known trader, Benedict Arnold, who was just a year younger than Joseph Rudd. At the time of her pension application, Sarah Rudd described herself as having lived through 3 wars. In fact, the French-Indian War would have begun when Sarah was 10 years old, like this one right here, in 1754, and continued until the signing of the Treaty of Paris, the first one, in 1763. Through the course of this war, Sarah would have experienced both the last days of her girlhood as well as the first years of her womanhood. This was a tumultuous time in our history, but this was the world that Sarah would have known. Her later actions as an adult would have been shaped by the experiences she acquired growing up in a time of war. It was also during the French and Indian War that the young Joseph Rudd first became a soldier, having served in the rank of private in the Connecticut militia. In 1765, after the conclusion of the 7 Years' War, the 25-year-old Joseph Rudd would leave Connecticut to build a log cabin in Bennington. Though no such documentation has been found, we might surmise that he would have known Sarah prior to his journey to Bennington, since they grew up together in the same Connecticut town. She would have been 19 years old at that time, and given her long life, she was most likely strong and healthy. She was certainly of marriageable age in that century. We can imagine that perhaps Joseph's purpose in moving to Bennington was to establish a homestead for himself and his future wife. What we do know is that in 1768, on September 28th, when he was 28 years old, he married Sarah Story, who is now 24 years old. According to an article published in the Bennington Banner on July 27, 1977, their marriage by General Jedediah Dewey took place amid the festive atmosphere of a local house raising. This house was the house of John Wood, which would later become known as the Hubble Mansion, or the 1768 house, which, ironically, is currently a wedding venue. So the first wedding to take place at the 1768 house was in fact Sarah and Joseph Rudd, as far as we can tell. So it remains a popular wedding venue. So according to the article, Rudd had been keeping company with the young and attractive Sarah Story, who had moved to Bennington prior to that time. The good Reverend, perhaps seeking to prolong the festivities, asked Joseph if he would care to marry Miss Story then and there, and the Reverend himself would waive the fee. Joseph, I think, liked a good bargain, so he agreed. There in their work clothes, surrounded by friends and neighbors, Sarah and Joseph Rudd were married, and a long, very rich history of Hubble homestead weddings had begun. Later, Sarah would describe their domestic life in Bennington as being settlers in a new region, and I think this gives us a clearer picture of their home life. They would have needed to be determined, hardworking, and self-reliant in order to make a life on a New England subsistence farm far away from their families in Connecticut. We can imagine the strong partnership Sarah and Joseph must have had to settle on a hardscrabble farm in the Pleasant Valley wilderness of Vermont. Actually, we that night to the drive up Pleasant Valley Road, which is where Sarah and Joseph had lived. Sarah and Joseph's marriage would be a romance forged through the hardships of early settlement, through 2 more wars, through sacrifice and service. It was a marriage that would eventually also include 8 children. Just a short year after they were married, their first child, Celinda Rudd, was born on August 6, 1769. Within the span of 1 year, Sarah Story had become a wife and a mother. She would continue to support the work of her husband and the day-to-day workings of a young family on a New England farm, in addition to caring for her baby. Meanwhile, unrest was coming once more to the colonies. 1 year after Celinda was born, tensions between colonists and British soldiers would lead to the Bloody Massacre, as Paul Revere would call it in his engraving, later known as the Boston Massacre. At this time, Joseph also received a commission signed by Governor Chittenden of Vermont, indicating that he had been elected to the office of second lieutenant in the company's militia of Bennington, with the 2nd Regiment of the Militia of the state of Vermont. Now, it's a significant mark of trust and leadership that Rudd was elected to this position. Unlike the Continental Line, which would later form, militias elected their own officers. This means that the men he knew were the ones who chose him to be a leader. They trusted him and they wished to follow him. A commission of this nature was not so much influenced by political means or financial standing, but instead by the strength of one's character and the confidence of his peers. On June 11, 1773, Jeremiah Rudd was born. While Sarah nursed their son and went about the daily tasks of the farm, Joseph would have been carefully oiling and cleaning his flintlock musket, waiting for the time when he would be called upon to use it in defense once more. Over in Boston, tensions between the colonists and the British soldiers would erupt on April 19, 1775, in the towns of Lexington and Concord. A shot was heard around the world, and the American Revolution begun. As the Continental Congress scrambled to form and fund a new nation, they also had to create and provision an army. Artillery would be crucial for the Continental Army, and for this, Congress would look toward Fort Ticonderoga. On May 10, 1775, Benedict Arnold, Ethan Allen, and the Blue Mountain Boys would capture the British fort. Just as the early seeds of American rebellion began to germinate, the Rudds again experienced birth of another kind. Little Sarah Rudd, this is child number 3, was born on May 30th, 1775. A few weeks later, the Americans would once more face off against the regulars at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Perched on the New York and Vermont border, Joseph Rudd had declared himself a patriot. The young man who fought beside the British in the 7 Years' War was now an experienced veteran and willing to take up arms once more, this time against the very same nation with whom he had fought as a younger man. According to Sarah's pension application, within a month of little Sarah's birth, Joseph was called out to militia service. She stated, "I was very unwell, and my 3rd child was less than a month old. I still remember very distinctly his absence this year on public duties, and my own distress in consequence." In the year following her birth, a new nation would be born as well. In March of 1776, the British soldiers would evacuate Boston in favor of New York. By July, New York Harbor would see the arrival of 32,000 British soldiers. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, the Declaration of Independence would be signed and a new nation born. Once more, Joseph Rudd would be called to public service, acting again in defense of his country, while Sarah remained at home caring for their farm and children. Silas Walbridge will later recall that he believed Rudd should have served at Ticonderoga for a period of 2 months in 1776 at Mount Independence. Rudd served under Captain Elijah Dewey in Colonel Moses Robinson's regiment of militia. This time he served for 28 days, beginning on October 18th. There the men labored to build a star-shaped wooden picket fort. After completing the fortifications, they constructed barracks within the defense. Their numbers there were so great so as to dissuade the southward advance of the British fleet out of Canada. The quick retreat of the enemy upon the site of the American fortifications was a great triumph to the patriots in these early days of our independence. Across the ocean, meanwhile, General John Burgoyne was busy preparing plans of his own. New England had been the seedbed of the Revolution, and he theorized that the British could take full control of New York. They would effectively cut New England off from the support of the rest of the colonies. With care and attention, Burgoyne laid out his New York campaign. It called for a three-part attack, a maneuver that would overwhelm the provincial troops left to defend the upstate territory. Though they did not know it then, Burgoyne's campaign and the challenges associated with it would have a direct impact on the lives of Joseph, Sarah, and their young children. On April 13th, 1777, baby number 4, little Joseph Rudd, was born. Though we have few details about Sarah's various pregnancies, her pension records indicate that the birth of young Joseph may have been a difficult one. In her documents, she described herself as being in feeble health at the time of the battle in Walloomsac, which was about 4 months after baby Joseph was born. We can conjecture whether her feeble health was the result of a difficult birth, postpartum complications, or simply the exhaustion of simultaneously caring for the family farm, an 8-year-old, 2 toddlers, and an infant, or some combination of those three, while her husband once more marched out to meet the enemy. Joseph Rudd and his brother John would depart for Mount Independence in May of 1777. Lieutenant Rudd served once more as an officer in a company under the command of Captain Elijah Dewey and Captain Samuel Robinson. That spring, Rudd set out to face Burgoyne carrying his musket and a sword, leaving Sarah to defend the home front and their children. The musket belonging to Joseph Rudd is pictured here, and that's belongs to the collection at the Bennington Museum. You can see it on display. Go ahead. The star-shaped fortifications on Mount Independence that they used to turn away the British just the year before were abandoned on July 6th. The lines of fortifications these men had built just the year previous were left standing to shelter the enemy. Ticonderoga had been well provisioned to sustain the American troops with flour, meat, coffee, wine, porter, sugar, medicines, and other such necessities. Now all of these would go to the British. Just a year before, Joseph and his fellow militiamen had experienced a great victory in this very place. We can only imagine the sense of grief they must have felt turning over the very fort they had labored to build and fortify to the likes of General Burgoyne. However, there was little time to lament this loss. From their hasty retreat, the Green Mountain Rangers made their way south. The following morning, at Hubbardton, the rear guard covering the patrol retreat would engage with the British forces at the Battle of Hubbardton. This fierce battle would be the only battle of the American Revolution fought in Vermont. As Burgoyne continued his way south toward Albany, his supplies ran increasingly low. In order to remedy this difficulty, a contingent of about 1,100 men, including Braunschweigers, Loyalists, and Native Americans, were sent to Bennington in order to collect supplies, mounts, and reinforcements. Here, Burgoyne knew that the Americans had been stockpiling supplies that he desperately needed. Burgoyne's orders given to Blanc gave him the following instructions. It is highly probable that the Corps of Green Mountain Rangers, under Mr. Warner, now supposed to be at Manchester, will retreat before you. But should they, contrary to expectations, be able to collect in great force and post themselves advantageously, it is left to your discretion to attack them or not. Always bearing in mind that your corps is too valuable to let any considerable loss be hazarded on this occasion. All persons acting in committees or any officers acting under directions of Congress, either civil or military, are to be made prisoners. I always tell my students, in other words, General Burgoyne said, don't do anything stupid. Fight, don't fight, but be smart about it. We all said it. On August 11, 1777, Colonel Baum set out on his mission. As Baum and his troops moved about the countryside, they were seen by many colonists who helped to spread the word that Baum was on the move and heading to Bennington. It is likely that this is how Sarah knew Baum's destination. Having grown up in the danger and trauma of the French and Indian War, and possibly having had family members who were captured by Native Americans during that time, there is a story about her brothers being captured and haven't been able to confirm that. Sarah now feared for the safety of her children. The Brunschweigers heading toward her had also earned their fierce reputation in blood at the Battle of Long Island. Equally concerning was the fear of attack from her very own Tory neighbors. 60 years later, Sarah would recall the events of that summer, saying, "It was an eventful year. I can never forget, while anything of memory lives, my flight on horseback and in feeble health, with my babe and 2 other small children, and my eldest daughter running on foot by the side of me from Bennington to Williamstown, under circumstances of great alarm and fear from Hessians, Tory enemies, and Indians, and in absence of my husband at this, the time of my trial, for months before and for months after." In the face of danger, Sarah Rudd found herself with a decision to make. She could stay in the comfort of her home and attempt to protect it from invading enemies, or she could risk the loss of her home, her livelihood, her crops, and carry her children to safety. Even 60 years after the event, her words bring forth the fear and panic she must have experienced in stark transparency. This was a woman who had known more war than peace in her life. She had lived before in fear, but even now she did not allow herself to be crippled by it. As a mother in a weakened state of health, with an infant, 2 toddlers, and an 8-year-old, she knew she was in an especially vulnerable situation. Her assessment of her situation and her resulting choice to protect her children demonstrates agency and decisiveness. The fact that she felt confident to make decisions for the household may also be an indicator of some of the equality in her relationship with her husband. If nothing else, her actions are an indication that Joseph trusted her to make decisions in the best interest of their family. With her children safely in her arms and at her side, because poor Belinda could not fit on that horse with the other 4 of them up there, she escaped to Williamstown on horseback and brought them to safety. Meanwhile, Joseph was among the American militia who stormed the Boone breastworks at the hilltop in Walloomsac, which would later become known as Passion Hill, misnomer, at the Bennington battlefield. Here he would have a close encounter with a stout-built Hessian, which would take on a quality of legend in the years to come. Over half a century later, Amos Scarles would recount this circumstance from the battle, and at the time they stormed the Hessian breastwork. Mr. Rudd related to me that he carried his sword and a gun into the Battle of Bennington, that after he with the others had stormed the breastwork and the Hessians were retreating and firing, he snapped his gun at a stout-built Hessian, and that from some cause, and for the first time on that day, his gun missed fire. That he pursued to grapple with the Hessian, to take him a prisoner. The Hessian turned and raised his piece to fire, but Mr. Rudd said he was so near to him that by a spring and a quick effort, he knocked the Hessian's gun up, and as he grappled with him, drew the Hessian's sword instead of his own, and gave the Hessian, a severe blow to his neck as he broke from him and turned to run. And that Mr. Herrick struck the Hessian with the butt of his gun and killed him. Mr. Rudd said he always regretted Mr. Herrick's killing the Hessian, for he meant to have brought him in as a prisoner. The sword Mr. Rudd took from the Hessian I have seen. I have also heard Mr. Herrick often relate repeatedly the same story. And there is that sword, which you can also see at the Bennington Museum, and it is listed as a sword captured from a German at the Battle of Bennington and donated to the museum by the Rudd family. In a letter to his father, written shortly after the battle, Joseph Rudd wrote, "After my duty, I take this opportunity to write to you, hoping these few lines will find you well. As for the goodness of God, they leave me and my family. We met with a great deal of trouble on the 16th instant. Myself and Brother John was preserved through a very hot battle. We killed and took, according to the best account we can get, about 1,000 of the enemy. Our loss was about 30 or 40. We marched right against their breastworks with our small arms, where they fired upon us every half minute, yet they never touched a man. We drove them out of their breastwork and took their field pieces and pursued and killed great numbers of them. We took 4 or 5 of our neighbors, 2 Snyders and 2 Hornbecks. The bigger part of Dutch music was in the battle against us." Remember, those would have been Sarah's neighbors, Dutch music. Interestingly, there's no mention of the skirmish with the stout-built Hessian or the sword in Rudd's letter to his father, leaving the reader to question the validity of that story. But then again, you know how you tell stories to your friends in a different way than you tell them to your parents? I can't help but notice he left that part out of the story to his father. Maybe you just won't mention that grapple. But Rudd's words in this letter give us another important detail about Sarah's decision to flee her home. Dutch Huzik, just over the border of New York, was a veritable hotbed of Tories. If the American militia was once more defeated, as they had been twice in the previous month at Fort Ticonderoga, or Mount Independence and Hubbardton, Sarah and her children might be left at the mercy of these neighboring Tory enemies. Battle lines drawn between neighbors tended to be especially complicated and hot. At the Battle of Bennington in particular, some of the fiercest fighting took place at the Tory Fort, in which all those who engaged in battle were colonists. Bearing this in mind gives us a greater sense of Sarah's urgency in fleeing Bennington. The battle at Walloomsac was a great victory for the American militia and a crushing defeat to the British. Thomas Jefferson, in a letter to John Stark in 1805, described it as the first link in that chain of successes which issued the surrender at Saratoga. This decisive battle would leave Burgoyne at an even greater disadvantage than in his previous state. Joseph Rudd, veteran soldier and officer, would survive this battle and stay through the next battles to come. He would remain in service through the capture of Burgoyne. This surrender must have been an overwhelming victory to Joseph and his men, who had experienced loss at the hands of Burgoyne the months before at Mount Independence and Hubbardton. Though Joseph did not know then, the victories at Bennington and Saratoga would turn the tides of this war. What had been a farmers' provincial rebellion would become an international conflict, a world war fought between the most powerful imperial nations in the world, and Joseph Rudd would have his part to play in the years to come. In 1778, Rudd would hold the office of second lieutenant and serve approximately 3 months. In this year, Rudd would witness and sign a court-martial, which would be submitted as evidence for Sarah's pension in 1737. In March of 1779, the Rudds would welcome a new baby, Lucy, into their family. That fall, Joseph was called out to public service again through the months of September and October and stationed at headquarters in Castleton. Lieutenant Rudd would return to these headquarters again in 1780. The commanding officer of the post was General Ethan Allen. Rudd served under Colonel Herrick and Colonel Hutchins, the latter being Rudd's captain, but who would be ordered to the command of another company. Rudd served just over a month that year. In the year 1781, we would see Rudd return to Castleton, this time for about 1 month. His son Enos would be born on March 12, 1781. Martha Rudd would be born on June 28, 1783, just months before the signing of the Treaty of Paris and the official end of the War for Independence. The last of the Rudd children, David Rudd, was born on March 16, 1786, and he would be their only child born as a United States citizen. Joseph Rudd would be remembered as a hero by those who knew him. The trophies he had brought home from the Battle of Bennington, the stories of how he had obtained that sword would have been told and retold against the silent warmth of the family cabin and hearthside for many years to come. As a soldier, he held the respect of his comrades he had served with, as well as the admiration of those who grew up in the shadow of the turbulent birth of our new nation. One of those children was Erasmus Cook Merrill, who was born just a few weeks after little Sarah Rudd on June 18, 1775, in Farmington, Connecticut. Merrill would immigrate to Bennington in 1791, where he would apprentice under Anthony Caswell and study law. He was admitted to the bar in 1804, and most likely it was during this time that he first became acquainted with Joseph Rudd. Merrill would serve as major in the War of 1812 and go on to have a distinguished career in law. The following year, he was elected a Vermont state senator in 1836. Now, the following year, Sarah would seek the support of Merrill in applying for a pension for the service of her late husband, Joseph Rudd, under the 1832 amendment to the Pension Act, which allowed militiamen to receive the pension. This esteemed man would remember Joseph Rudd, as one who had done much service and a brave officer in all our commemorative occasions, which until late years were annually observed. He was always in the arrangements of the day, put in the place of honor among the bands of surviving heroes and veterans who fought for independence. That brings us back to September 21st, 1837. Sarah Rudd, with the assistance of Erasmus C. Merrill, acting in the role of Justice of the Peace, applied for a pension for the service of her late husband, Joseph Rudd. At the age of 93, Sarah described herself as having lived through 3 wars in her pension application. On December 20th, 1837, the Bennington Probate Court gave the following statement. Here comes the plot twist, folks. That not being an actor in the public service and a woman whose duties compelled her to tarry with the household, she can know but little of her own personal knowledge that is definite as to the particular period or station of her late husband, Joseph Rudd's services. Because obviously they never talk, right? Come on, Bennington. It is her duty not to hazard her integrity of character of 90 years growth by stating, and this is underlined in the transcript, facts, which as a woman, a wife, and a mother at home, she cannot have very distinctly known at the time, much less be particular in after this lapse of time. To add insult to injury, it was further implied that the documentation to verify which was the court-martial document, and the Chittenden certificate submitted by Mrs. Rudd may have been in some way altered. So they accused her of being a liar and a woman who didn't know her husband's business, obviously. So we can conjecture many, many reasons for this verdict by the probate court. Somebody asked me, they're like, well, maybe she just didn't have enough documentation. And I said, right. They could have just said didn't have enough evidence. Give us more evidence, right? Instead, they kind of accused her of lying. First, we consider the blatant discrimination indicated by the court on behalf of Mrs. Rudd's gender, a woman, a wife. Their argument was that since Mrs. Rudd was not present in service with her husband, she could not have possibly known the details of his enlistment. Which to me seems a rather flimsy argument, since it's this author's opinion that the Rudds had a close relationship given their number of children and their long and happy marriage. We also know that Sarah often served as the head of household while her husband was in service, indicating some mutual respect and a sense of confidence not always afforded to her gender in other relationships during that time period. Furthermore, it's highly probable that Rudd told his wife about where he was going in his terms of service. We do know that the artifacts Rudd brought home from the Battle of Bennington were much admired by neighbors in the community, and their story was told often. So that seemed to indicate that Rudd relished the role of storyteller, and he would have therefore been eager to share his adventures with his closest companion, his wife. In fact, since Sarah was the one left responsible for the care of the farm and the children while Joseph was away, his duty would have been of particular interest to her, since she was entrusted with his responsibilities while he was in service. Sarah's responsibilities of womanhood and motherhood also posed challenges in the pension process that her husband would never have faced had he been alive to apply. Erasmus C. Merrill pointed this out in one of his correspondence. 1 year after the first fighting of the American Revolution had begun. Some pretty quick math indicates then that the youngest of the soldiers who served in the war and their widows married at the time of last service would have been in their mid-70s by the time this act was passed. Another quick Google search tells officers often talk about their experiences soldiering together and that they heard others speak of their father's service. The brothers also indicated, and we have a sword in our possession which we hold as a venerable relic and memorial of our deceased father's peril professed in the Battle of Bennington, it being the sword of a powerful Hessian, with whom, in the midst of the battle and immediately after our troops scaled the breastwork of the enemy, he had a personal encounter and disarmed of said sword. Since Enos and David would not be born until 1781 and 1786, respectively, one can imagine how much these boys must have revered this battle trophy which their heroic father had brought back from war while defending their community. After tireless work and over 90 pages of cursive typewritten correspondence, the pension for the service of Joseph Rudd, veteran of the Old French War, American patriot, Revolutionary War soldier, and militia lieutenant, was approved. Sarah Rudd received a pension for the service of her husband at a rate of $106 per annum, beginning on March 4th, 1838. She was 94 years old, nearly blind, and lived with her two younger sons. While we know very little about her final days, we do know that the younger ones were shadowed with war and hardship. We know that she showed great courage and care for her children in a time of fear. We know that she labored hard to support her husband and to feed her family. We can therefore hope that the monies of the pension received might have provided her with some comfort in her last years. Our final payment voucher indicates that the last payment of the pension was made in the first quarter of 1843. Sarah Rudd passed away at the age of 97 on October 11, 1842. She is buried in the Old Bennington Cemetery beside her husband. The couple who partnered to work the land of their farm rest now together, not far from the cabin in which they made their home. The children of Sarah and Joseph would go on to have children, grandchildren, and many great-grandchildren of their own. Many of these Rudd descendants, I have learned, are still living in New York and Vermont, and they have one here. Every time I lecture, somebody pops up who's a Rudd descendant. So it shouldn't come as no surprise that my own home on Roadside Road in Pittstown, in which I did most of my writing and research, had been previously owned by a Rudd descendant. I like to think that during all those hours of research and writing, the spirit of Sarah sat quietly by my side, passing me small pieces of information as I worked to build a more full picture of one person's life in the context of a small community in a vast rural America. Sarah's life was not a famous or a glamorous one, but it was an important one. We see in her story the face of a woman, a wife, the mother at home. We are reminded that each of us alive today stand here because of the women like Sarah who came before us. Women who mothered and protected our ancestors, nourished our forebears, and gave life to those who came before us in an unbroken chain forged through the links of motherhood. Though we can never know the stories of all of these remarkable women, we are fortunate and grateful that Sarah's story, one which connects so many people, is ours to treasure. And it's also worth noting that Sarah's story would not be as complete as the story we have had her pension been granted on December 20th, 1837, and through denying that pension, we have been given such a gift in knowing her story more fully. As we prepare for the 250 Centennial, it's important for us to broaden our understanding of the roles of diverse populations in our history, and that includes the stories of women like Sarah. I did want to end by inviting you all on May 18th to join us for the second annual History and Heritage Fair, which will be out at the St. Paul's Armory. It's a free event. There will be historic societies and museums there, with theater displays and artifacts for you to look at. It's a great opportunity also to network with other historians. I will be on Hessian Hill. I will have my cooking and a tent set up, and I'll be doing military encampment activities for families at the battlefield itself. You can take the trolley. It's a free trolley tour. We have a tour down on a trolley coming to that if interested. I hope some of you will stop over and see us then. I also have chicken barbecue tickets if anybody is interested. I happen to have those today. You can see my assistant if you would like that. Thank you so much. So Sarah